Much of the content on YouTube about note-taking focuses on producing beautiful notes or second brains and these knowledge bases. And I want to talk about note-taking today because I don't think that this is primarily the most effective way to go about note-taking for self-study. The goal of self-study is understanding, not producing notes in of itself. I'm going to introduce you to 8 general principles that you can apply to your note-taking to make it more effective, as well as look at how I take notes for 2 very different disciplines. I'm studying the great books of the Western world, but I'm also studying for a master's in engineering. And these are very different and they require 2 different styles of note-taking. But let's be very clear about what I mean by note-taking and who this applies to. There are lots of different reasons to take notes and they have slightly different aims. If you are taking notes to write a book or a novel or a research paper, then that's a slightly different thing to taking notes for study. I am a hobbyist learner, an autodidact, a Renaissance man, whatever people want to call it nowadays. But the primary gain of this is merely my own self-improvement. There is no external examiner and there is no essay at the end of this, which means that my note-taking can be adapted to that end. We'll later see when I look at my engineering notes, which is for a degree program, how those notes are slightly different because of that. And I'm a big advocate that if you are reading or studying, you should be taking notes. But why is that? And the reason is because studying and reading difficult works is difficult. And your brain, it just doesn't want to do it. If you don't take notes, it's very easy to fool yourself into thinking that you are doing studying. You can read pages, hundreds of pages, and then you'll walk away and think, well, what did that mean? And that's because sometimes these works are impenetrable, sometimes the work is technical and complex, and we must take time to slow down and really dive in and check our understanding. Not only does writing notes check that we've understood a work, but note-taking is the act of thinking. It isn't just a record of thinking. By taking the notes, we actually do the work. And as I said, I've got 8 general principles for how to do effective note-taking. Note-taking should be personal. Note-taking should be specific to the subject and the task at hand. Note-taking should take place with pen and paper. Note-taking is not memorizing. Note-taking is not collating material. Note-taking is certainly not copying. Note-taking must include active summary, and in general there are only 3 types of notes that one should take. So let's dive in, let's explore each of these principles more fully, and then at the end of the video I'm going to show you some actual notes that I've taken and why I think they're effective. Okay, first up we've got note-taking should be personal, and what I mean by this is that gaining knowledge and studying is a complex activity. And I consider complex activities like art and music, where there is no specific way to do it. There is no sort of manual or step-by-step process. Any complex task is a process which develops over time through practice and engagement, and it is specific to the individual. And it's important to understand this because whenever you listen to anybody talk about a complex activity, you must understand that that is their process. And that doesn't mean we can't engage in their ideas and we can't try the things that they suggest. But if they don't work, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. It just means that they don't work for us. Moreover, as you continue to take notes, especially if you're a beginner, you're going to get it wrong and you're going to make improvements over time. There is no ultimate system for taking notes and you need not choose one for the rest of your life. You know, I've always thought that when people have a note-taking system and then they decide it's not adequate and they chuck it all out and then they start again, that this is just nonsense. Note-taking is simply something that we do while we study to aid our study. Note-taking should be specific to the task and the subject at hand. What I mean by that is no 2 subjects are the same. Any attempt to produce a note-taking system which crosses a broad range of subjects is doomed to fail. If you're studying maths or engineering or physics, your notes are going to be of a completely different nature to the study of literature or great books. The mode of thinking is different, and so the note-taking as the act of thinking must also be in a different mode. But not only does the subject differ, but as I mentioned in the introduction, your task differs. When we take notes just for study, that's a very different thing from taking notes for review or for research or for writing at some later date. I do think that it's important to separate these activities. If you are going to write about something, you must first understand that thing. And it's very tempting to think that, well, I go through this text once and I can take all the notes I'll ever need to take on it. But that just simply can't be the case. We should separate the activity of note-taking for understanding from note-taking for later writing. And the value of doing that is that your notes about what to say about something or what to write about something will be very different once you've understood it. And this is probably controversial, but I do think that your note-taking should be on pen and paper. There are lots of different ways to take notes. There's Obsidian and Evernote and all sorts of knowledge-based tools, but pen and paper is the simplest and the most effective. And one of the reasons that is because pen and paper is very flexible. You need the freedom to be able to arrange information, draw diagrams, arrows, doodles, whatever it takes to gain understanding. And I know that people have very complex systems which allow them to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things on their computer. But that little bit of resistance, that little step, makes the studying distracted. Suddenly, instead of engaging with the work, we are engaging with the technology. And what's important is that our notes are an expression of our thinking process and also the thinking process itself. Anything that gets in the way of that process is an inhibitant to gaining understanding. Pen and paper is a constant reminder that the purpose of what you're doing is to study, not to produce beautiful work or produce these knowledge databases. Pen and paper is inefficient and it's slow and it takes time, and that is precisely the point. By slowing down and engaging more fully, we actually achieve more than producing hundreds of notes with hundreds of words in. There's research out there that evidences that when people write, their brain engages in a much more detailed way than when they type. I don't know how true those studies are, but what I do know in my own personal experience is that I remember and I recall much more of what I write down longhand than I do when I type. And that leads me to the next principle, which is note-taking is not memorizing. People disparage rote memorization, and for good reason, because far too much education has become just rote memorizing facts. But there is a place for it. There are equations and systems and facts that one must memorize if they are to study a subject. But note-taking is not the place to do it. You're much more better served by a system like Anki or any spaced repetition system if you need to memorize things. You shouldn't be under the illusion that by taking notes on something, you'll memorize it. And there's, at the moment, this sort of obsession with building systems where you'd memorize everything you read. And these claims are absurd and not true. There is no way that you can memorize everything you read, nor should you. In fact, you should only memorize what is most important. If you take the time to deeply understand ideas by taking effective studying notes, you'll find that you memorize stuff for free. When information is well integrated into the things that you already know and well practiced, it becomes easy to remember. You don't think about how to multiply numbers together because it's a well integrated piece of information. Note-taking is not collating material, and you probably got a sense through this video that I'm not a huge fan of knowledge bases or second brains. I consider them to be busy work that distracts from the actual task at hand of studying. And I think my evidence for that is that of all the people that talk about this stuff, I see them produce very little of worth outside of books and articles and videos about how to produce a second brain. It's that sort of marketers who sell marketing sort of effect. It's like, great, you built this second brain, but what exactly did you do with it? Though it is very tempting to fake the art of studying by just pulling loads of information together into a note-taking system. And we should constantly remind ourselves that this isn't real work and it's not real study. Take, for example, chemistry, where when you burn different elements, they produce different coloured flames. Now, we could just pull all the information together of which colours go with which elements, and as I say, you may actually need to memorise that information to be an effective experimental chemist. But if we never take the time to understand why it happens, then we've really missed the point, and having the information to hand is of no real use. Wikipedia has done a much better job of collating information than your notes ever could. Note-taking is not copying, and if you take one thing away from this video, it's that your notes need to be in your own words. Okay, and highlighting and underlining is just a lazy version of copying that engages even less of the brain. The act of distilling a text down into your own words is an act of thinking. It's a very active and engaging way to study, and it's exhausting. Sometimes multiple pages can be condensed down to 1 or 2 sentences that really pull out the essence of that work. I always think of the chef who makes the broth. You boil down the vegetables and the meat and the bones, and what you're left with is a really potent, delicious stock. And it's the same for writing in your own words. When you copy out what somebody else has written, you really just waste your time. You should close the book. Okay, active recall is a really powerful tool for remembering more of what you read, and it's a really powerful tool for making sure that you've understood what you just read. If you can't recall what you just read, then it's probably the case that you didn't understand it. So I've said that note taking can fall into three broad types of notes, and the first of which is note taking for understanding. So this is what I've primarily been talking about. As we go through a text, every few sentences, paragraphs, or pages, depending on the density of that text, we need to write in our own words what we've understood by that text. Moving on from that, we need to summarize, actively summarize our work. And what I mean by that is that we write notes that summarize the chapter or the section. And I do this at multiple levels of abstraction. So there will be summaries for the section, which is a shorter piece of the work. And then there'll be a summary for, say, the chapter, which is more general. And then I might write a summary for the whole book or the whole work, which will be really just focusing on the main thrust. And what this multiple levels of summarizing helps us do is pull out the details, but then also pull out the point and pull out the overall argument. Next, the last type of note that I take is the fleeting thoughts, insights, connections, and ideas or questions that I have. And I write these so that I can explore them on the page. I've never found it to be so effective to just capture them and then come back to them later. You're unlikely ever to come back to them. You'll just move on to something else. So as I have a question, I explore the question on the page, or a thought, an idea, or an insight. Sometimes this can actually be the most fruitful part of the study session. It means that I don't progress through the work as quickly, but it means that I get something much more important, which is something that's not already in the work. And that is really the goal of studying. And my last principle is that note-taking is about process, not product. This serves to remind us that we are not trying to produce a beautiful work. We are not trying to produce a perfectly laid out piece of information. We are not trying to produce something that is going to wow others or impress our own egos. We are trying to study. And note-taking is a process of understanding, it is a process of thinking, and it is a process of study. And we should not lose sight of that while we're taking our notes. Anytime we find ourselves worrying about things that do not aid our understanding, we need to remind ourselves that we're doing this to improve our understanding. Okay, so we're looking at my notes here, and obviously the first thing to note is that this is not a literal piece of pen and paper. This is a Remarkable Paper Pro. I'm not against technology where it serves the same purpose as pen and paper. If you're not familiar with them, they are digital notepads. They do nothing else but act as a better version of pen and paper, and it means that because I travel a lot, I can carry all this stuff around without having endless notebooks. There is nothing in this that you cannot achieve with a set of coloured markers and piece of paper. When my Remarkable last summer was stolen, that's exactly what I did. Okay, so what we're looking at here is some of the notes that I take for my Masters in Engineering, which will then contrast with the notes that I take for my study of the great books. So at the top in the light blue, we've got a definition. And I'm very selective about the definitions that I decide to record. I'm very conscious that I'm not trying to collate lots of different material. So I only write down what I think I'm likely to be tested on or examined on at a later date. So obviously engineering includes a lot of maths, and I do that study in red just to separate it out. Here we're looking at a worked example to do with calculus. And something I always do with worked examples when I study is I first attempt them on my own, and then I use their guided steps to correct me the least amount possible so that I can continue to make progress. And I find this is a really effective way of understanding a worked example in your own terms without just skimming over them or just copying them out. By studying your own mistakes and correcting them is a really powerful way to ensure that you've understood. Now, this is a really good example of what I was talking about when pen and paper allows you to be flexible about how you arrange information. I wanted to compare these two notations side by side, and all I had to do is just write them side by side. I didn't have to create columns or interact with the technology. I could just think and express it as a direct expression of my thought. Now in green, this is an example of that summarizing process that I was talking about. This is at the end of a section in the book, so I've written a summary of what we've learned. And then right at the end here, I've written a section summary, which is much more general. I've not included any notes about differential calculus here. I've explained to myself why this skill is important to engineers. I've looked at the wider context. I've answered that question of why did we study this? And I find that a really useful summary to make. Okay, so now we're looking at the notes that I take for my study of the great books of the Western world. And this is a completely different type of study. One, because it's a humanities subject, not a technical subject, but also because I do this for myself. I don't do it for anybody else. There is no exam or collation of work that I have to do. I don't have to write assessments for anyone. All I do is produce YouTube videos from this. At the top here, we can see 3 very common notes in this type of note taking. So in the red here, we've got questions and thoughts that occur to me while reading the text. And these are often the things that I go on later to write about. And I capture these and often produce quite lengthy explorations of them. In the black, you've got those understanding notes, okay? And when I'm reading difficult work, I often pull out every single plot point and turn it into a note in my own words, which ensures that I'm engaging with the text. And then in the blue, I've got a quotation from the text. I always think that if you're going to quote a text, you should take the time to write it out in longhand. And the reason that I do that is because it prevents me from just over-quoting the text. If you can just copy and paste the words, you don't really think about the value, and you're very likely to just start collating and collecting quotes because you feel like you should. When you write them out longhand, it's inefficient and it takes effort, and that makes you selective. Another advantage of that is if it's a difficult passage of the text, by writing it out longhand, it often slows you down enough to think about every word. And when you think about every word in that sort of detail, a difficult passage suddenly becomes clear. Just because it's humanities doesn't mean that I'm not summarising my thoughts. And I find that in this style of note-taking, my summaries are much longer. And I do these at the end of chapters mainly. And in it, I'm trying to capture what the main argument was, what the main ideas were, what I thought about it, and what, in this case, because the task at hand is ultimately a YouTube video, what I might say about it. I hope that this discussion of note-taking principles helps you have more effective study sessions in the future and helps guide your own thinking about your personal note-taking process. But if you disagree with anything I said, or you've got your own ideas and techniques, I'd love to hear about those in the comments, and maybe I can make a follow-up video where we discuss more about note-taking, because I think it's a really important topic to get right so that your study is effective. Now, I want to thank you very much for listening. My name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice.